lest we forget. In this week's Cape Rebel, we recall the start of the Anglo-Boer War 120 years ago, on 11 October 1899. In the words of Deneys Reitz, the author of Commando, of Horses and Men. In Adrift on the Open Veld, the Deneys Reitz trilogy, published 20 years ago, Trevor Emsley concluded his introduction as follows. The decision to publish the trilogy in a single volume was motivated by the desire, 100 years after the cry, "Op sail, kerels!" first sounded across the veld of the Transvaal and Free State republics, with distant echoes in the Cape and Natal colonies, to recall vividly the story of two small nations' fight for independence and the continuing effect of that freedom struggle in the dramatic years up to the 1940s. The Deneys Reitz trilogy gives an astonishing continuity of insight into what Smuts called the wonderful romance of South Africa. In 1902, the Boers lost the war, but won peace on favorable terms. By 1907, General Louis Botha was Prime Minister of the Transvaal, a self-governing colony, and by 1910, he was Prime Minister of a united South Africa, including the Cape and Natal. Yet the bitterness of reaction to the suffering and loss of men, women and children in British concentration camps, more than double the total number of fighting men lost on Commando, was to leave an indelible mark for decades to come. Who can deny that past brutality gave birth to future oppression, and that the wrongs of the second half of the 20th century were closely bound up with those of the first? It is thus with a somber sense of historical reality that we recall the start of the Anglo-Boer War 120 years ago, with the following extract from Chapter 3, entitled To the Frontier, of Commando, of Horses and Men, by Deneys Reitz. After a monotonous journey of 3 days, often broken by interminable halts, we reached Sandspruit, a small station about 10 miles from the Natal border, where we detrained. There were great numbers of burghers from the country districts already encamped on the plain on either side of the railway line, and veld on all sides was dotted with tents and wagon lagers. On the left of the track stood a large marquee, over which floated the vierkleur flag of the Transvaal, indicating General Joubert's headquarters. When we had detrained our horses and helped to ground the guns, we moved away to where a halting ground was assigned us. We off-saddled in the tall grass and, after building fires and preparing supper, we spent our first night in the open. For the next 10 days, we lay here, enjoying the novelty of our surroundings as if we were on a pleasure jaunt, rather than seriously awaiting the coming of war. One evening, my brother and I received a pleasant surprise, for there arrived in camp an old servant of ours, grinning from ear to ear at having found us. His name was Charlie, a grandson of the famous Basotho chief Moshesh. He had been a family retainer ever since I can remember, first in the Free State and then in the Transvaal, whither he had followed us. Latterly he had been on a visit to Umbandine, king of the Swazis, but learning that there was to be war, he returned at once to Pretoria, and my father had sent him on to us. He was more than welcome, for we could now turn over to him our cooking and the care of the horses, duties which we had been performing ourselves up to then. Moreover, he had brought me a splendid roan, which my father had sent me, as he feared that the Basotho pony would not be up to my weight. Ever since the Jameson raid, the Transvaal government had been importing large quantities of Mauser rifles from Germany, which were sold to the burghers at a nominal fee, and as great stores of ammunition had likewise been accumulated, the commandos were very efficiently equipped. The two republics had mobilized between 60,000 and 70,000 horsemen at this moment, distributed west and east, ready to invade the Cape Colony and Natal at the given word. This great force, armed with modern weapons, was a formidable fighting machine which, had it been better led, might have made far other history than it did. How many troops the British had in South Africa, I do not know, but they were pouring reinforcements into the country, and I think our leaders underestimated the magnitude of the task on which they were embarked. So far as our information went, in regards to Natal, the nearest British troops lay at the town of Dundee, some 50 miles away. This force we subsequently found to be about 7,000 strong, and still farther south, at Ladysmith, they had another 6,000 and 7,000 men, but with fresh troops being landed every day, it was difficult to say how soon the scales would dip against us. On the 10th of October, a great parade was held in honor of President Kruger's birthday. We mustered what was then probably the largest body of mounted men ever seen in South Africa. It was magnificent to see commando after commando file past the Commandant General, each man brandishing hat or rifle according to his individual idea of a military salute. After the march passed, we formed in a mass and galloped cheering up the slope, where Piet Joubert sat on his horse, beneath an embroidered banner. When we came to a halt, he addressed us from the saddle. I was jammed among the horsemen, so could not get close enough to hear what he was saying. But soon word was passed that an ultimatum, written and signed by my father, had been sent to the British, giving them 24 hours in which to withdraw their troops from the borders of the Republic, failing which there was to be war. The excitement that followed was immense. The great throng stood in its stirrups and shouted itself hoarse, and it was not until long after the Commandant General and his retinue had fought their way through the crowd that the commandos began to disperse. The jubilation continued far into the night, and, as we sat around our fires discussing the coming struggle, we heard singing and shouting from the neighboring camps until cockcrow. The next day, England accepted the challenge and the war began. Once more the excitement was unbounded. Fiery speeches were made, and General Joubert was received with tumultuous cheering as he rode through to address the men. Orders were issued for all commandos to be in readiness, and 5 days' rations of biltong and meal were issued. Flying columns were to invade Natal, and all transport was to be left behind. So my brother and I were obliged to send Charlie to the central lager, where wagons were being parked until they could follow later. War was officially declared on the 11th of October. At dawn on the following morning, the assembled commandos moved off, and we started on our first march. As far as the eye could see, the plain was alive with horsemen, guns, and cattle, all steadily going forward to the frontier. The scene was a stirring one, and I shall never forget riding to war with that great host. It has all ended in disaster, and I am writing this in a strange country, but the memory of those first days will ever remain.